So the obvious one that we think about is obviously like things like literary features, literary devices, reading a text and being able to understand characterization, right? Why does character exist in a text? What is the author's purpose? And then finding the dual meanings maybe within figurative language itself. So both the literal and figurative meanings of a text. And again, sometimes texts have more than one meaning. As I mentioned earlier, that we are looking for the intention of the author. We've been doing a lot of context, and we know again that the way an author uses language reflects their behaviors and attitudes towards particular subjects. So we're really looking at the identity of the author and how that is worked into a text, even if per se the characters in the text don't agree with the author. From there, this is a communication between author and the idealized reader. At the end of the day, an author wants to convince you of some sort of ideological framework. They want to persuade you. So they have an idea of who that particular audience could be, as well as possibly they're kind of preaching to the choir. There's already an audience that is there that agrees with the author, and they're simply just speaking to an audience with prior knowledge. This next one, transformation, the borrowing of other pre-established works. So sometimes authors will borrow ideas, styles, and incorporate them into their own work with maybe a different intention than the original work itself. That leans very heavily into our studies into intertextuality. That's coming later, but that is something that we do look for when we're doing a close reading. And then we have, obviously, within this course, we're always thinking about how our close readings connect with our conceptual focus. So we've looked at all 7 of our concepts at this point, and you'll see a bit of that today while I'm modeling. The last thing is post-structuralism and reader agency. When we do close reading, sometimes we find issue with how certain ideas are represented, or maybe it's the language itself, and that leads us to have a springboard, a conversation about how to read text beyond just what the author intended. And that's really the power of reading as a whole and our agency. So, case in point, when you guys have been doing your research, you've been digging into the time, the place, and the general production of the text, and maybe some of the general reception of the text. And you have an idea now at this point why an author chose to write the way they did and what they're trying to establish in their work. With Shakespeare, though, Shakespeare's interesting because we don't really know why Shakespeare wrote Othello. Or rather, there are many theories about why Shakespeare wrote Othello. Some people say that Shakespeare is simply racist. This is an inherently racist play. Some have said that this is a vehicle, a sense of protest or agency to combat the racism of its time, but in fact, through some of the racial stereotypes, it actually inadvertently perpetuates some of those issues through its depictions of race and also language that is used. And then some have said that this is full-blown a combating of the toxic stereotypes of the time period towards Moors, North African folk, and also just generally black populations within Europe. And many of you will say, Mr. Reed, well, how can you do that? How can you talk about that when we know that, again, race as we see it today may have not existed, or at least the thought of that may have not existed back in those days. And there is some argument to be made about that. But also on the flip side of that, when we do talk about post-structuralism, like we are thinking about ideas that exist outside of the text. And so, yes, we could look at this through a critical race theory. We do think about the representational nature of race in a text and how it's constructed in a text, despite the fact that it might be older. The same thing goes for like feminism as well, or class. So enough of that. Let's do a quick model. So this coming from Act 1, Scene 1, the first couple of lines here. Iago, zounds, sir, you've robbed, for shame, put on your gown, your heart is burst, you have lost half your soul, even now, very now. An old black ram is topping your white ewe. Arise, arise, awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil make the grandsire of you. Arise, I say. What tellest me of robbing? This is Venice, my house is not a grange. My grave Bombraccio, in simple and pure soul I come to you. Zounds, sir, you are one of those that will not serve God. If the devil bids you, because we come to you service, and you think we are ruffians, you'll have your daughter covered with a Barbary horse. You'll have your nephews neigh to you. You'll have coursers for cousins and genets for Germans. What profane wretch art thou? I am one, sir, that comes to tell you your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs. Thou art a villain. You are a senator. So I'm going to go ahead and just break this down for you as quickly as I can and just kind of show you again how we do a close reading. So skip to the parts that you feel are needed and appropriate. I've given some reference points here. So Iago, right off the bat, we know he is our antagonist. He is a dynamic character. He pushes the plot forward. His plan in general here is very much in the embryonic stages, but as we've discussed, he's going to token out or otherize the ethnicity and the general complexion of Othello and his racial makeup. And as a result of this, on the greater end of this, near the conclusion, we really kind of get to see the exposure of racism and racial attitudes during that time period by characters who at first we maybe sometimes sympathize, but then we start to see that like underneath that there is still these racial attitudes within larger institutions of power. Your heart is boast. This is a motive language. There's a sense of projecting here by Iago on Brabantio, who is a senator, and obviously that this is again like he's saying your heart is burst. You have lost half your soul. Like Brabantio doesn't have control over this language. This is being projected on him. Now, we have this, again, the sense of tone, the sense of immediacy. It's very emotional language. Topping, we've talked about how that the use of diction there tends to lean towards sexual imagery. The white ewe, there's this sense of innocence. We talked last year a lot about the binary opposition of white versus black, this idea of like the black ram versus the white ewe and how that's connected to ugly versus beautiful, the innocence versus loss of innocence. Alliteration, there's quite a bit of pacing going on here because again, like this is supposed to be happening so quickly that people can't respond to Iago in time. He does this with intention, right? That's the power of his character. Devil will make you a grandsire again. Here we have the representational nature of Othello's identity and this theme of reputation here. He is a senator. He holds a particular status. He has to kind of uphold certain social norms, and so the idea of a man who is seen as kind of a half-wit, lower status, kind of almost like threatening him to an extent, but also warning him about his reputation here. That's very deeply problematic for the character. This is Venice. We talked a little bit last year about how that's an example of metonym. It embodies an entire group of people, a community, ideas. It's not just simply a city. It is a symbol of wealth. And this passage here deals again heavily with Iago's animalistic imagery and how that's sort of being Brabantio's being affronted by this act of both vengeance and animalistic nature. In Simple and Pure Soul, I come to you, and again, Rodrigo, who kind of plays the opposite end here. He plays the almost kind and soft, honest person. Who, ironically, obviously, that's not the case because he is just as bad as Iago. But the irony there, too, is that Iago will exploit this character of his. Iago says, you will not serve God, which is really kind of challenging, again, the time period that this is a country that is heavily Catholic. So we have a little bit of cultural context, but also challenging one, especially with who wields a significant amount of power, especially a man. There's a little bit of ethos here as well. If the devil bids you, right? So again, aside from the animalistic nature, we have literally the good versus evil. Iago kind of putting these two things into categories. You are either good or you are evil. There's really no in between. You have to choose. You have to be one or the other. So this is a good example of metaphor and obviously racial connotations with it. You'll, you notice that there's a couple of examples of repetition of your and you. Again, kind of reinforcing this pronoun use here as well, that this is your choice. You have to choose. And they're sort of inferring the binary of both wealthy versus poor and the themes of reputation here. A little historical context. Obviously, England has been at war with the Anglo-Austrian Empire. I don't know actually if I got that entirely right there, but they have been at war. So for the time period, the use of alliteration here, it just kind of rolls off the tongue very very well. But it's also kind of a wink at, or kind of a nod or a poke, I guess you could say, at Germany. I am one, sir. Again, like Iago kind of putting himself into the role of both controller, but the one who is the most ethical of them, and that people should listen to him. He wields power with his language. The last thing, you are a senator, right? Again, bringing this up, his reputation, his status in society as a man, the metaphorical weight of his actions or how he is perceived. Very, very important to this story as a whole. And some of the social context is that there is this implication of the issues of racial marriage, especially during that time period. So returning back to our slide here, zooming out a little bit, now that we have identified, again, the conceptual and the figurative and the metaphorical here, is that there are a couple different issues you could think about, right? Like if we're looking at identity or culture representation, we can look at the racial stigma and perceptions of mixed marriages, right? Possibly in this passage, we could talk about toxic masculinity in political institutions. I said this because, again, like they were men who were running these institutions. So how exactly are they asserting their own masculinity in this, and some of the sensitivities of that as well as being a man being challenged? And then finally, the emotional taxation of a reputation-based culture. This idea that like reputation is just so heavy, and the fact that Iago so easily usurps both the emotional and the literal positioning of power of Brabantio, leads to kind of like a pretty traumatic experience for Brabantio. Not to say that we should sympathize with him, but again, like that culture is very much based in reality, right? So just remember that as you are pulling any sort of global issue from a text, that it should be an issue that you can see in the larger body of work.